Meine Damen und Herren, liebe Pamela Rosenberg, an der Stelle, wenn ich die Freude habe, eine Veranstaltung zu eröffnen, sage ich immer gerne, liebe Freundinnen und Freunde der Staatsbibliothek. Ob Sie das schon sind, das weiß ich nicht, aber vielleicht wird der heutige Abend dazu beitragen, dass Sie der Staatsbibliothek gewogen sind. Die Betonung liegt heute einmal nicht auf der Willkommenskultur. Hierfür sorgen ja Abend für Abend Diskussionsrunden in den Fernseh-Talkshows nach wie vor. Nein, die Betonung liegt heute sehr bewusst auf dem Wort Beyond, was sich ins Deutsche am besten übersetzen lässt in jenseits der Willkommenskultur oder auch über die Willkommenskultur hinaus. Und beide Übertragungen treffen zu. Denn wir sind hier in der Staatsbibliothek zusammengekommen, um der Willkommenskultur zu einer kulturwissenschaftlichen Metaebene zu verhelfen, indem wir uns rezeptionsästhetischen Fragen der Migration zuwenden und uns darüber austauschen, wie sich das Thema der Flucht in der Kunst und in der Wissenschaft niederschlägt. Also zum einen in der bildenden Kunst, im Theater, im Film, in der Belletristik, im Tanz, in digitalen szenischen Medien und weiterem. Hier sind dann zwei Stränge zu unterscheiden, nämlich die Künstlerinnen und Künstler aus den Herkunftsländern und jene aus den Aufnahmeländern. Es wird, so darf vermutet werden, hinsichtlich des künstlerischen Sujets und der künstlerischen Formensprache durchaus einen Unterschied geben, ob der Maler, der Lyriker, der expressive Pantomime aus Syrien stammt oder aus Bad Homburg im Taunus. Und wird hier Kunst im Paralleluniversum produziert, die sich kaum kennt und wahrnimmt, oder existiert zwischen hiesiger und importierter Migrationskultur eine osmotische Beziehung, die voneinander profitiert, sich vielleicht auch provoziert, in jedem Fall aber einander produktiv zur Kenntnis nimmt. Die zweite Säule aber befasst sich mit Integration and Academics. Und hier zeigt sich zum ersten Mal, wie sinnfällig es ist, den heutigen Abend hier in der Staatsbibliothek auszurichten. Denn auch unser Claim, wie man so sagt, heißt für Forschung und Kultur. Und es sind eben jene beiden Sphären, die wir in der Bibliothek Tag für Tag immer gleich und doch auch immer neu mit Leben füllen müssen und die Gegenstand auch unserer Tagung sind. Es sind nicht die Artistic Approaches allein, sondern ebenso und gleichberechtigt auch die Academic Approaches. Denn mittelfristig müssen wir uns einigen drängenden Fragen stellen. Wie lässt sich der Akademisierungsgrad junger Migrantinnen und Migranten steigern? Welche Chancen haben umgekehrt wissenschaftlich ausgebildete, ausgewiesene Forscherinnen und Forscher, die in ihren Herkunftsländern für akademische Karrieren bestimmt waren, unter veränderten wissenschaftsorganisatorischen Grundbedingungen? Wie können sie hier in Deutschland Fuß fassen? Aber auch wissenschaftliche Infrastruktureinrichtungen, wie vor allen Dingen die Universitätsbibliotheken, müssen sich mit neuen Herausforderungen auseinandersetzen und sich fragen, wie Migrantinnen und Migranten die akademische Literaturversorgung leichter wahrnehmen können, wie es ihnen erleichtert werden kann und ob ein Beispiel, Lehrbücher, die bislang nur in der deutschen Ausgabe erworben wurden von den Universitätsbibliotheken, zukünftig vielleicht zusätzlich auch in einer englischsprachigen Fassung angeschafft werden können oder sollten. Meine Damen und Herren, den Austragungsorten von Veranstaltungen soll, es ist jedenfalls schön, wenn es so ist, eine gewisse Symbolik innewohnen, damit im günstigsten Fall ein geradezu kongeniales Verhältnis zwischen Content und Location existiert, damit die Authentizität des Ortes ein wenig beflügelnd auf das Ergebnis aller Statements, Referate und Diskussionen wirkt. Liebe Frau Rosenberg, Ihre Entscheidung für die Staatsbibliothek war in diesem Sinne goldrichtig. Denn wir sind seit jeher eine in ganz besonderer Weise internationale Bibliothek. Nicht allein, dass unsere Bücher allenfalls zu einem Drittel aus Deutschland stammen, das zweite Drittel stammt aus England, den USA, Italien und Frankreich und das dritte Drittel aus Osteuropa, aus China, aus Korea und Japan. Und so international wie unsere Bücher sind auch unsere Leserinnen und Leser. Eben weil wir wissenschaftliche Literatur in derart vielen Sprachen anbieten, sind wir für ein weltweites Publikum so attraktiv. Probleme von transnationaler, ja globaler Dimension zu erörtern, liegt also in einer Einrichtung, die sich seit mehr als 350 Jahren als Gedächtnis des Weltwissens begreift und in jeder neuen Gegenwart ihre Bücher entleiht für ein neues und besseres Weltverstehen in Deutschland, in Europa und überall auf der Welt. Seien Sie in diesem Sinne herzlich willkommen hier in der Staatsbibliothek. Vielen Dank.
Liebe Frau Schneider-Kempf und alle Kollegen in der Staatsbibliothek, it is a great honor for us at the American Academy to enjoy your wonderful hospitality, which is generous and appropriate, and also extremely important, not only to the session we begin this evening, but to the theme of the session, which speaks not only to the most important parts of the mission and purpose of the American Academy, but also to the relationship between the American Academy and the city of Berlin. It is a perfect location for us in our ambition to move into the city while keeping our identity in our beautiful villa on the Lake Wannsee, to move into the city and into public discourse that is at once scholarly, as you just said, but in the public service, which speaks to the civic ambitions and civic identities of so much academic, public, and artistic culture in the city. When I started thinking about a new period for the American Academy about 2 years ago, it seemed to me that despite our diversity of program, the individuality of the scholars, thinkers, artists who come to us as fellows and as visitors, we should somehow also think collectively about themes that in a way everybody is thinking about, but especially people who are thinking about what we call the transatlantic relationship and its comparison, and at a moment of particular need and in a way danger. And in early 2016, the theme of migration integration struck many of us as something that everybody should be thinking about, and perhaps more rigorously and with more dialogue between the fields, between academic life and artistic life, between specialists and citizens, and that this is something the American Academy could contribute to in an important way. So this event this evening, and we're so grateful to have your presence here, is a very important milestone in this ambition. It's a great pleasure to be able to introduce to you some of the artists and scholars who are in residence with us this semester at the American Academy. And it's just as much of a pleasure and, in a way, an important honor for our community to share insights and learn from people in the Berlin community, again, of scholars and artists who are also occupied in what has become increasingly and necessarily a reciprocal assignment. In other words, when we talk about beyond Wilkommenskultur, we're talking about a culture of mutual transformation. Whatever the position may be professionally, politically, we're talking about modes of change in the world that we need to participate in. The American Academy is in a villa that once belonged to a German Jewish banking family, the Arnhold family, that went into exile in the late 1930s, and then with enormous generosity in the 1990s helped restore that villa, following another one of our themes, and that is the theme of exile and return. In the 1930s and the 1940s, always with a high degree of complication, the United States was a receiving society of immigration. I emphasize always with a high degree of complication, but that was certainly the case. In 2015 and 16, the tables had turned, you might say, between the United States and Germany, again, with a high degree of complication, became the prime receiving society, certainly in the European sphere, of the enormous need that the global refugee community, with an emphasis on the Middle East, was experiencing. So the mission of the Academy is directly concerned with this topic, a topic that will clearly not go away, but will remain transformative in academic life, in artistic life, in a global community. So this evening is one in a long series of many different kinds of events, and I want to make sure that all of you feel welcome to pursue the programs, to join us in the Arnhold Villa in Wannsee, and also in events that we hope to continue in the city. And to say again how grateful we are for this extremely meaningful hospitality that you've offered to us, that really does mark in a very appropriate way what we hope to achieve. Let me offer you a couple of practical pieces of information. This session is being translated. If you don't understand what I'm saying, it may be because I'm not being clear. I will stop speaking in a minute, so that problem will be over. But if it's a linguistic problem, there are Kopfhörer available, and if any of you would like to claim these, we have simultaneous translation taking place, and the same will go in the other direction from German into English. We will have a break in between the two sessions. We invite you to join us for the break, which will also have some modest refreshments for you, but we count on your coming back for the second part of the program. The first panel, you know, is a panel of artists. The second panel panel, a panel of scholars and academics, and those of us who have planned this, especially my colleague Pamela Rosenberg, whom I want to thank with particular gratitude for your work and expertise. We are very excited at the combination and excitement among the panelists. So let me wish you a very good evening, to say how pleased we are that you are all here, and to invite Pamela to come up and begin with the first panel. Thank you.
I will start by introducing the panelists, and then we'll get into questions posed to them. On my far left is Josh Kuhn, who's professor of communications at the Annenberg School at the University of Southern California, where he also has a joint appointment in American Studies and Ethnicity. He's also directing the Popular Culture Music Project at that university's Norman Lear Center. And he's worked as a curator and artist with SF MoMA, the Getty Foundation, California African American Museum, Los Angeles Public Library, the Autry National Center, and the Santa Monica Museum of Art. His research focuses on the arts and politics of cultural connection, with an emphasis on popular music, cultures of globalization, the US-Mexico border, Los Angeles, and Jewish American musical history. His Audiotopia, Music, Race in America, which was published by the University of California Press in 2006, won the American Book Award. Kuhn has written for the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, American Prospect, and Los Angeles Magazine, and he, in this semester, is a fellow at the American Academy. Julia Grosse is the co-founder and editor-in-chief of Contemporary and, a magazine dedicated to reflection on and the linking together of ideas, discourse, and information on contemporary art practices from diverse African perspectives. Contemporary and is a project of the IFA, of the Institute for Foreign Relations here in Germany. She studied art history, German, and media at the Ruhr-Universität in Bochum, and followed that by working as a junior culture editor for the Springer Verlag. And for over 7 years, she has worked as a cultural correspondent in London for the Frankfurter Allgemeine Sonntagszeitung, writes for the AD, Taz, Marianne, the Süddeutsche Magazine, and Heiser. She reports on art and architecture, fashion and design, as well as writing about social issues. Welcome. Raven Chacon, to my right, is composer of chamber music, experimental noise music, and an installation artist, originally from the Navajo Nation. His compositions are written for a variety of ensembles, for musicians and non-musicians, and for social and educational situations. Chacon is a member of the indigenous art collective Post-Commodity, which was founded in 2007 and which has created many artworks, such as the 2-mile land fence art border intervention, repellent fence, in 2015, and exhibited The Ears Between Worlds Are Always Speaking, which he was presented at Athens, the Documenta in Athens this summer, as well as The Blind Curtain, which was presented then in Kassel at the Documenta. As an educator, Chacon has served as composer in residence for the Native American Composer Apprentice Project, where he taught string quartet composition to hundreds of American Indian high school students on reservations in the Southwest. This project was awarded the National Arts and Humanities Youth Program Award in 2011. Raven is also a fellow at the American Academy this semester. Jörg Heiser is the director of the Insitut für Kunst im Kontext, or in English, the Institute for Art in Context at the Universität der Kunste here in Berlin. And after studying philosophy, American studies, and Anglistik, He gained his doctoral degree at the Humboldt University in the Faculty of Art History. His dissertation, Doppelleben Kunst und Popmusik, has since been published in book form by Sternberg Press. And in 2003, he became co-editor of Frieze magazine, and in 2011, then the publisher of Frieze.de. He writes for several national dailies, including the Süddeutsche Zeitung, and is a frequent contributor to art publications and catalogs. He curated several exhibitions, including Romantic Conceptualism at the Kunsthalle Nürnberg, and then Funky Lessons here in Büro Friedrich in Berlin. And he's the author of All of a Sudden, Things That Matter in Contemporary Art, and Plötzlich diese Übersicht, was gute zeitgenössische Kunst ausmacht. Both books are published by Sternberg Press. I'm going to introduce to you also a person not present, but he had been, was going to be part of the panel. And I think it's important to go ahead and introduce him because he was an artist here in Berlin who was going to talk about a project about gegenseitige Integration. Anyway, you know what I mean, I hope. Helmut Oehring. He unfortunately is home sick in bed with really massive influenza. He was born in 1961 in East Berlin of deaf parents. He's a self-taught composer and guitarist, and he wasn't able to attend university because of repeated conscientious objection to the DDR military service. So between 1990, after the wall came down, then he was a Meisterschüler of Georg Katze at the Berliner Akademie der Kunste, of which he has been a member since 2005 himself. 1994-95, he was at the Villa Massimo, and in 2008, he received the Arnold Schönberg Prize for his complete oeuvre, which included over 400 compositions. In addition to composing, he has worked as a director of musical theater, instrumental theater, and staged concerts for many years. His autobiography, With Different Eyes, was published by Random House in 2011 and was adapted for film based on his screenplay and his music. He relates the journey of how, as a child of two deaf parents, he became a composer. In many of his compositions, he incorporates roles for deaf artists. This is an intriguing exploration of identity and perception, and is perhaps one of the reasons that he sought collaboration with refugee musicians as a next step in mutual exploring of identities. In September 2017, the premiere took place in Potsdam of his scenic concert, what he calls a scenic concert, Finsterherz oder Orpheus 17, based on thoughts from Monteverdi's L'Orfeo and Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. It is work for soloists, orchestra, tapes, and live electronics. Several of the soloists were refugees and exiled musicians, including deaf refugee performers. Oehring said that he wanted to foster artistic and biographical encounters between all of these soloists with the musicians of the Kammerakademie Potsdam, performing contemporary music, jazz, and Syrian avant-garde. I wanted him to tell you a bit about how these encounters in the rehearsals evolved, and unfortunately that is not happening. So I can just report that sitting in the audience, I thought that the piece really succeeded on various levels of through changing aesthetic perspectives to really transmit diverse identities and their mutual responses. We'll have to leave it at that, but that's why he would have been here, to give us kind of a living example of what in some ways we're going to be talking about tonight. Topics dominating the art world in the past few years have been identity, ethnicity, cultural appropriation, post-colonial discourse, etc. And with the numbers of migrants and displaced persons increasing worldwide, questions of exclusion and participation have been added to the mix and have taken on an urgency and gained really broad political relevance. Since 2015, the issue of absorbing quite large quantities of people from other cultures has become rather acute here in Berlin and in Germany. And though the United States has been a nation built largely on immigrants, it continues to be consumed not only by the questions raised by regarding the rights and raised by assimilating more newcomers, but also by questions raised regarding the rights and identity of disenfranchised Native American population, as well as those of Latinos and others, either with or without papers. So I had asked each of the panelists just to share 2 or 3 short thoughts with us before we then get into a deeper discussion. Or I hope it's deep. Maybe it's just wide. Okay. So, Josh, why don't we just go like this?
Sure. On anything. Chime in.
If you don't want to.
All right. First, I'm thrilled to be here, and I'm really grateful to have been asked to be a part of this conversation and to be in a library, though there's no books in this part of the library, but to be in the library. Libraries, I work a lot with libraries in Los Angeles and in the US and do a lot of public humanities, public music projects with libraries. And while welcome culture is not a term that circulates in the United States in any real way, I'd say the only functioning welcome culture that actually exists on the ground of the United States often happens in public libraries. These really important spaces, civic spaces that don't ask for papers, where freedom of movement in and out through ideas and knowledge and the arts happens all the time. So I'm always grateful to be able to be in a library space. My work focuses on really how to use music or how to live through music and live with music as a way of thinking about these larger questions of belonging, of identity, of culture, of nation, and how music allows us to rethink the experience of living in a borderlands. As you mentioned, Pamela, while there's a contemporariness to these conversations, and the word urgency is talked about a lot. We talked a little before the panel, and I think all who pay attention to these issues know, is the risk of framing these conversations with a present urgency. While there is some great validity to that, the risk of that is it can elide this massive history, centuries of structural histories that go into the making of this present moment. And so in the context of Los Angeles, for example, we're a city that is constructed literally on physical migrant labor, but also on the labor of migrant aesthetics and migrant imaginations. Los Angeles does not exist without immigration. It just doesn't exist. And therefore, there's a constant need to go back and reassert that history into the present so that we don't think that there's a newness. And I know that I think in Germany, this is also a debate about welcome can signal that, well, this is new, that this is just happening right now. And in fact, that there is this larger history. A lot more to say, but that's what maybe I'd start there.
Yeah, thanks again for inviting me as well. As Pamela mentioned, I'm the co-founder of Contemporary End. It's an online art magazine, or an art magazine which mainly exists online because, speaking of a global network, for us it has always been important to reach readers from the diaspora and Africa as well, and beyond. So it's important to have a young artist from Mali being able to read what we're producing, as well as a curator from Baden-Württemberg or or from Amsterdam or the US, etc. So that global aspect has always been important to us. And the core team is based in Germany, but in a way, speaking about centers, in a way, Contemporary End has no real center, because the center, in a way, is the network of global partners we work with, writers from Dakar to Amsterdam to Oslo, people in the diaspora. And for us, the idea of art from Africa is something really not tricky for us, but we're in a way going beyond this idea of art from Africa or an African artist, because looking alone at the African continent, what has let's say a performance artist from Joburg in common with a painter from Dakar? Nothing really, because there are 54 countries in between. And this is something we're really focusing on. That's why Contemporary End, in the title, you won't find any, let's say, hint on Africa, because of course there's still the need to have a focus on let's say artistic production from Africa and the diaspora, because it's still not common practice to have non-Western artists included in the art world. There's still a lot of work to do, but we try to do it by kind of using the term beyond as well, getting beyond these expectations and stereotypes, etc. So if we later are going to talk about expectations, it's really interesting as well as from our perspective what experience we have with, I don't know, let's say curators, a French curator in Dakar doing studio visits, having particular expectations, what to find, what kind of artistic aesthetics, etc. And often this disappointment, if you, for example, have the work of a young Senegalese artist and it looks not African enough, these old cliches, and it looks like, oh, this could have been done by a German artist from Berlin as well. And this kind of disappointment we're still experiencing on juries, etc. The term not African enough. So this is something we're challenging every day in our work.
Thank you, Pamela, for inviting me to be a part of this group today. Most of my work is as a composer, as a music maker, and that has led me to also being an educator of music to people in my own community, which is the Navajo Nation. And so some of the things I end up thinking about is inclusion, but not inclusion of migrants into the dominant culture, but rather my own people, the indigenous people, how they are integrated into the arts, and gauging their interest gauging their interest of what they want to do in music and in the arts, and how I can bridge that, but still have them retain their identity. In addition to that, I am part of a collective called Post Commodity, which is 3 indigenous artists, also from the Southwest. And we came about because of, I think initially we came about because of these expectations, like Julia is speaking of, where in the Native American art world, there's a certain idea of what your work is going to be before people even encounter it, or they expect certain kinds of not only aesthetic looks or identities associated with the work, but also the topics that you'll be speaking about, especially if those topics are going to reinforce a binary of Native people against the white man, for instance. That's the easy one, the obvious one. But what Post Commodity is more interested in, and I think this manifested the best in our piece Repellent Fence, is speaking about the complexities of not only these identities but of places, and kind of highlighting the gradients of people that represent these places, these contested places, such as the U.S.-Mexico borderlands. And And so for us, it has been to not necessarily provide solutions. We hope, as art can do effectively, is bring attention to topics that the rest of the world might not know about. But at the same time, we hope to, where we can, complicate these issues, bring new questions to what is happening, identify everybody involved in these situations, and at the end of the day, still find an opportunity to retain some mysterious beauty.
Well, I also thank Pamela and the American Academy to bring us together to discuss these pressing and important issues. And I guess what I can add to what's already been said is that from my own personal experience as someone working at the University of Arts, this is in some way a day-to-day question for us and on several levels. The postgraduate master course I'm teaching with others has about a third German, maybe a third European, and a third non-European students. And out of those students, a substantial part have experiences with the Ausländerbehörde in Berlin that have been not always pleasant. And questions of prolongation of visa have become more difficult in the wake of the so-called welcome culture, because there was political pressure to be more strict, and which has been executed, this pressure. And we're at the receiving end of it, trying to make it possible for students to make this possible, even though we're a free course, which in itself is, I think, an achievement. It is still hard for some students to make a living and to make it work unless they come from wealthy backgrounds, which of course we don't want to favor. And this is one level of it. Another level is that the University of Arts in 2016 started, which I think was a very good project, started a project called Refugee Class. But even within that first year, it became clear very quickly that the members of that class were taking issue with that very name. And as you already pointed out, there's always this issue of avoiding the kinds of segregations that produced the problem in the first place, and trying to reflect on one's own position in terms of how one sometimes maybe inadvertently but still does perpetuate certain patterns in trying to help, and or trying to make something possible, or trying to make interaction possible, or inclusion. And that brings me to the question of terminology, even though you could think, oh, this is just terminology, but the terminology formats or conditions certain ways of thinking or perpetuates them. And even though we can be sort of discussing these subtleties, we also at some points kind of take terms for granted, including myself, I would say. For example, when we talk about, in German, when you talk about Migranten, migrants, we almost inevitably mean these are people coming not from France, not from the UK, not from Poland. It must be something far away, right? Which is a weird distinction being made there. Or another term, expat. What is an expat? I mean, you have the same terminology in Eastern Asia also, expats in China and stuff. But where does that distinction come from? I mean, it does reflect a certain question of privilege and access, but it does so in a way that doesn't indicate and lay open these differences of privilege and access. And I think this is something we need to really address in these terms, not only in terminology, but what comes from that. And in Germany, for me, that has a lot to do with the non-existence of a German immigration law, which is a curious fact if you think about it, that a country of that size doesn't have a proper immigration law at all. And which at the same time means that the asylum seeking law in the German constitution, which I think is a major achievement, that it was written into the constitution in these very clear and universal terms, is being questioned all the time. And we've had that discussion already 20 years ago in Germany, and we were getting closer to it, and then that discussion stopped 20 years ago, or 18 years ago to be precise. And then it urgently needs to come back, I think, this discussion.
Thank you for these various thoughts. I'm going to start by asking Josh Kuhn a question. I mean, he's pointed out to me that the philosopher Thomas Nail has declared the migrant the political figure of our time, and declared the urgency of engaging with new theories of social motion. So leading on from this, Josh Kuhn has said that he's interested in the sound of social motion, the acoustics of expulsion. And what is the music of this new paradigm? What's the music produced by and in response to globalization? What sonic narratives, auditory styles? Anyway, much of your exploration of these questions has been in the realm of the US-Mexican border, cross-border interaction. And so my first question is, what are some of the conclusions or what have you found out? And then have you also found a couple of answers to a question that you've also asked, which is, what has been the role of music and sound in shaping international ideas about the politics of integration? And if those are two big questions, just answer one.
It's easy to answer the first question because it's still February, so I don't have any answers yet. So that was easy. Second question, but you can come to my talk on March 20th. Well, I'll have all the answers at the Academy. But let me focus on the second one because I think it perhaps ties in more directly in some of the ways to some of these debates and issues. I mean, one of the things I've always been interested in the history of the United States is the role that music has played, or the way that music has been employed as a metaphor in political philosophy. And employed as a metaphor for thinking about diversity, employed as a metaphor for thinking about cultural pluralism. Music has given us the dominant metaphor of thinking about issues of assimilation and integration and diversity in the United States, which is the melting pot. This very famous idea that is still with us. This is an idea that actually comes from a British play about a composer who's trying to compose the ultimate symphony of America, the great American symphony that would be the great melting pot. And so the melting pot was actually the name of a symphonic idea that then takes over and becomes this dominant way that we tend to think in the States still of this model of democratic belonging. And the melting pot is a really flawed model because it's a model that has always been about assimilation into a singular race. I think it's, arguably it's a model that is racist or racialist at the very least at its core, producing a singular American race. The orchestra was then used later in subsequent decades as a model of what became known as cultural pluralism, that, if you have an orchestra of people, the violinist has their instrument and has their own sound, but then ultimately everyone plays together and produces the same thing. So a lot of my work is about trying to find other ways of sticking to music, particularly I write about popular music styles, as not resulting in symphonic order. Right? How can music be a guide for giving us new alternative ways of imagining social orders? New ways of imagining society. And so the kind of practice I've been writing about a lot right now comes from hip-hop culture and from what DJs started inventing in the 1970s, which is the crossfader on the bottom of a DJ mixing board, which quickly is when you're crossfading, you're taking a song that you're playing on one side, on input A, a song you're playing on input B, and instead of just trying to mix the two by jumping between them or replacing one with the other, the crossfader is the little thing that lets you toggle between the two and allows you to mix things together without erasing one or the other. And so I think a lot of what's been happening from my limited experience so far here is that there's still a lot of discussion where I know the word, it's interesting to me that assimilation doesn't seem to be used by Germans these days. Integration seems to be a phrase that to me just sounds like assimilation. It sounds like a different word for the same thing. And so I think that music can be a really helpful way for imagining society that doesn't automatically lead toward assimilation into what Raven mentioned before, assimilation into a dominant core. And I think music is a really powerful tool for doing that.
Yeah. Wow, okay. I'm going to ask each of them a question like this, and then after with this mass of responses, then we can really get into a four-way, five-way dialogue. This next question is both for Jörg Heiser and Julia Grosse, because the so-called international art scene is international and in so many ways globalized in the meantime. And for several years, Berlin has been a magnet for artists who have come here either to live or to be exhibited. So there is, it's an international scene, and in carrying on a discussion in Berlin about the situation of displaced artists and identity, one needs to be aware of the high level of interchange and communication already taking place in the international arts community. Having said that, there are artists who are not in the diaspora of their own free volition. And so I wanted to know how you see the mechanisms of visibility and participation and exclusion for these. Are there general differences in the cultural identity of exiled artists in their new environment in comparison to those who, of their own free will, travel and work in a cosmopolitan environment? Do they work with different senses of memory and longing? Yeah, and where's the fine line between empowering and exoticizing migrant art? Whoever.
Yeah, so from our daily basis, working with artists, featuring their work, etc., it's first of all tricky to have the term migrant artist, because what is a migrant artist? To which extension is he or she, a privileged migrant person who came to Germany, I don't know, from Cameroon by, let's say, normal airways, etc., with a privileged background, but still has a migrant background, which is obvious, but has obviously another vita or other ideas of why he or she is here than someone who's has been an artist in danger, or would be here like coming here with a different program, for example, because there are so many programs as well. A friend of mine does a program for artists in danger who focus in particular on people coming from, or creatives coming from difficult countries who, of course, weren't allowed to do what they do in their countries, etc. But it's, for us, it's really different to look at that one, migrant experience here, because, for example, we had a talk 2 weeks ago with a guy from an artist, performance artist and photographer from Cameroon, and he's been living in Belgium for the last years, but he's still has an immigrant background. So, and he has been in Calais for a longer period of time, doing pictures there, and he constantly found himself in between all places, because on the one hand he was there with the white journalists who were like, oh, is he going to steal my camera? But then they realized, oh, this guy has a camera as well. Why? He's a refugee. Why does he have a camera? And on the other hand, in the camp, the refugees or the immigrants kind of recognized him as one of them. And he was like, of course I have a migrant background, but I'm completely, I don't share any experiences. I didn't have, my travel here was completely different. I live an extremely privileged life, etc. So there's so many levels of artistic production here, etc. And what interests us, especially, is talking about expectation, what to produce, etc. Talking about what you said as well. Not only aesthetic-wise, but obviously content-wise. You have to focus on your trauma. You have to focus on identity politics, on economy, context within your country, etc. And what I found interesting talking to artists who came from Vietnam, for example, one artist from Vietnam I talked to, he kind of reflected this gazing. He kind of reflected it back on us by saying, I did a photo project just doing pictures of elder women in the streets, like 80, 90-year-old ladies walking along alone. And he was so shocked by seeing that, in the German streets, which is normal to our eye, but he was like, in my context, you would never, you would never leave your grandma, walking in the streets, after 5 alone. You would never do this. He was so shocked by this, to art, to art, I don't know, traditional understanding of family or whatever. You would never do this, and it was such a nice. Reflection of that all of these artists coming here, it's not a one-dimensional gaze, or look at them, but they're looking at our context as well, and are thinking, this is completely strange. And I like this reflection on structures we think are completely normal, but aren't in the end. So.
My observation about that, maybe focusing on the institutional landscape, so to speak, is that there are small speedboats and big tankers. And as you might guess, the big tankers have difficulties of changing their direction. And sometimes they simply don't. But the small speedboats, so to speak, I'm talking about private initiative spaces, sometimes funded, sometimes not, sometimes on their own initiative, have really changed a lot in Berlin in, I would say, the last 10 to 15 years. To give 2 examples, about 10 years ago, Eflux, the New York-based outlet, started a space called United Nations Plaza in Berlin, at Platz der Vereinten Nationen in former East Berlin, and that became a real hub for all sorts of people from all sorts of backgrounds, including Germans, meeting together there and starting a discussion that hadn't really taken place in this kind of intensity beforehand. And to give another example is Savvy Contemporary, a space in Wedding, which has been very important to not only address crucial issues of migration and post-colonialism, but also, for example, doing an exhibition about Polish history and how it's reflected in Poland in art and in popular culture. And so this is precisely what I think is important to get beyond the pigeonholing and, okay, you're from that background, so you address this issue. But looking sort of cross-sectional, lateral, in terms of like, what do we actually have in common in terms of the issues we're facing? Where are maybe certain differences that we also need to reflect more on? And how can we create the situation where so-called integration is not about whomever coming needs to adopt whatever it's there, but that there is a kind of mutual discussion around what the shared basis of both civic life and artistic discourse can be.
Well, that would be my question. Is, I mean, I'm getting to you in just a second, Raven. But my question would be: is how porous is the communication back and forth, or how, in your observation, the community here, are they reacting and also changing their perspectives the more interaction they have with, is there a willingness to be open to ones coming in?
Well, there's a certain split going down the cultural scene, I guess. And my optimism lets me think that a majority is trying to enter the discussion I just described or try to describe. But there's also a certain hard kernel of people who feel threatened by that, and often very privileged people, ironically, at the top of the food chain, so to speak. Just thinking of a person like Georg Baselitz, who's one of the most successful German artists, who not only has come out in several interviews attacking female artists, saying whatever they do is not worth it, but now also in a recent interview having basically outrightly attacked all the attempts to change German society towards opening up to migrants and refugees, and saying basically the opposite. And this is kind of astounding if you think this is someone speaking from a very privileged position, but that there is a deep kernel in his personality. Maybe I'm just over psychologizing it now, but there must be something of this. There's this nice German word, zu kurz gekommen, this idea always already not fully acknowledged, even though you are. And this is a psychological complex that puzzles me. I also see it with famous German philosopher Peter Sloterdijk, who's just got a nice piece in the New Yorker with subtle criticism, but ultimately saying, yeah, he's still this figure who explains us how the Germans think. And, well, he has always seen himself as being on the outskirts or the fringes of German academe, not fully acknowledged, not getting the kind of position that Jürgen Habermas had, for example. So now he's taken it out on German politics, saying that Angela Merkel is destroying the country, basically. You know, that's what it comes down to when you look at it. And his friend Rüdiger Safranski blows the same horn, saying he had this term, Germany is flooded, which is a classical Nazi trope. You know, and you just wonder what is going on there with these guys. And this is, of course, I could name more examples. Oskar Röhler, a German filmmaker, who prouds himself now of being a right-wing thinker. He said so explicitly recently. And you just think it seems to be seen as a kind of frisson now to take that position, to see yourself as being a kind of dissident by being racist, basically.
Yeah. And the interesting thing is, maybe, I wouldn't say it's a generational thing, but then you have really art students or young artists who really work together and do projects together, and are open and really interested, let's say from a Western or German perspective, to learn or to see or to understand the thoughts of the other person, you know. And for example, a young artist I know, she studied with Hito Steyerl. She is doing a series now, like a horror movie series about Lageso, for example. And this is something, of course, influenced through the co-producer or the partner, the artist partner she's doing this with, because he has been experiences Lageso from here to there. So this is something which is happening on another level, and this I think is important as well. But it's really sad to see on these high levels with artists who are in Forbes lists, etc., suddenly saying something like Daniel Richter. Huh? I can quote him as Daniel Richter. Yeah. Gerhard Richter, oh God, Daniel not. Gerhard Richter, saying that he's not interested in sharing his table with not black people, but the racist word and other non-European or non-Western people coming from abroad. So this is something he said in a conversation with a curator he was doing a show with. So, yeah. This is shocking, and I don't know if it's a generational thing, but it's fun.
I was just going to say that, having said that, I think another German term is sich an die eigene Nase fassen, to take your own nose. And I'm thinking about well-meaning young artists doing work about or with refugees, basically stuck in a narcissist hall of mirrors where the refugees become their objects. Projects and objects. And I had first-hand experience of the person co-running Moabit Hilft, this private initiative, people in the part of town where I live, in Moabit, which is near the La Geso that you mentioned, this place where in the autumn of summer of 2015, as many of you may remember, there was a large crisis of people literally not getting water and food because the local government failed to. And these people helped on their own private initiative, and they were really dealing with very basic questions of food and shelter. And then at the second level, of course, they were thinking about, okay, how can we get in people to work with kids and work with people so they're not stuck in this stupid situation of being in a little room with nothing to do, basically. And there were a lot of well-meaning people then coming up and saying, look, I'm doing a project with my sociology students. Can we use your refugees to make our research? Can I offer a tango lesson each week? Stuff like that, all of it. And he was bombarded with that stuff. And he said at one point, he just told people, hold off on the art for a moment, just hold off. And I mean, I'm saying that knowing that a lot of artists in Berlin actually themselves helped getting food and shelter. It's not that all of them were just thinking about their next project. They were thinking about literally doing what I think should be your civic duty, to help people in need. And we have a lot of discussions in our institute and in other courses at the UDK about these questions of, and that's the key word there, where's the agency? Who owns what in terms of owning, in the sense of owning the question of agency in terms of acting? Who has a say in defining what is represented in which way? And I think this is the crucial question that we keep having to ask when we talk about these interactions between so-called refugee artists and so-called, I don't know, what do you call them, Deutsche native artists. Again, we have to ask there who's kind of supposedly speaking in whose name. And that's what I meant when I said we really need to start with ourselves. Even though we also need to call out, I think, the kinds of examples of people trying to hijack the discussion, like Baselitz, for example.
Raven, I'd like you to continue this exploration of Josh's question about the sound of the acoustics of expulsion and the sound of social motion, because you have used many different sonic narratives and auditory styles in exploring these issues of identity. For instance, the Indigenous Art Collective Post-Commodity, of which you're a member, made the video installation A Very Long Line, in which a camera rapidly moved along the US-Mexican border to a discordant soundtrack of yours, as if it were from the perspective of a passenger driving by really quickly looking over at the other side of the border. Or at the Documenta 14 now in Athens, you created The Ears Between Worlds Are Always Speaking, which is an outdoor, two-channel, hyper-directional four-act opera about forced migrations, and for which you use testimonies from Syrians, Cherokees, Navajos, and Mexicans. For this, you installed long-range acoustic device speakers, which are used by police to control protests, including the big, enormous protests of Native Americans at Standing Rock. Obviously, you think through what you do that shapes ideas about the politics of migration. At least I think that's what part of your impulse is. Is it?
Well, sound has a big part in all of my work, and I guess that just came about because I started as a musician, and I still consider myself a musician. But I'm always, myself as a solo artist, and with Post Commodity, we're always thinking about what the role of sound is. It's not just to accompany the visuals, for instance, but really why sound, and what does sound mean to the different audiences that might encounter our work. For us, in the collective, we're all educators, so we're constantly thinking about the students from our own communities who might be taking in this work. And at the same time, we also get questions from these young people about the sound, you know, because a lot of times the sound is very new to them, or it's not what they're accustomed to. Actually, that you brought up Standing Rock is appropriate, because it makes me think of the role of sound at that gathering, and what you had there. You had a lot of young people. Again, that was a mostly native demographic, of course, at this Standing Rock gathering. But you had young people exercising sound making by way of traditional songs, you know, powwow songs, other songs from their tribe. You had a lot of hip hop, you know, happening. You had the crossfading of that. But even more powerful, of course, you had a lot of people exercising sound through prayer, so revitalizing sacred songs and using the time to be together there to pray. And maybe the prayer was seen as protest, but more importantly, it was to actually pray against this encroaching pipeline. And when you think of that, you remember how dire and how bleak it is in these communities where many times there is no music education. If you're a young person, you are not encouraged to become an artist or a musician. There's not even going to be a music class for the most part. If there is a music class, it's maybe marching band for the sports team, you know, the basketball team, or the marching band also does function sometimes in parades for, at least on the Navajo reservation, parades for code talkers and some of our veterans and elders. What sound can do is at least in our works and in the education projects that I do, is encourage these young people that is an option, so that art and music making can become a part of their lives, because that's the privilege that other young people in the rest of the United States, you know, in Connecticut or wherever, Rhode Island or New York City, they all have music programs. They can take music, and a lot of young people might be able to go and major in music, as I was able to do eventually. Because the reason for doing that, I feel, is that, this goes back to what Josh says about the melting pot, is that it's even more complicated than a melting pot. There's little cups, melting cups around the melting pot that you first have to go into before you get dumped into the thing that's already been stewing. And so you have to first make it into the melting cup as a young person of color, or coming from a lower class, and that becomes the group show, all Native group show, or all Latino group show, or all African American group show. And maybe somebody in the bigger melting pot, as Jörg says, will pick you out of there and decide to use you in their piece. But for me, it's giving an opportunity for these young people to catch up to that situation where they don't have to be the ones plucked out and chosen as a collaborator, not even collaborator yet, just chosen as content in some other kind of piece, but to make it so that there is a situation at least of the melting pot, you know, at least where there's equal collaboration in these situations.
I was just thinking this metaphor you just introduced with the melting cups made me think of the way, let's stick to the term, the melting cups are often played off against each other. How there's a certain mechanism at work, especially in populist arguing, that tries to take advantage of certain situations in order to play off one group against another. There's a very current example of the Bochumer Tafel, this was it in Bochum? Essener Tafel, sorry. Where now Sarah Wagenknecht from the Linke jumped onto the case saying, well, there's another example. Our German population is underprivileged or doesn't get enough money, and now they're supposed to share their food with foreigners and immigrants. And of course, there's a kernel of truth. I mean, there is a truth to what she says in the sense that, of course, yes, economic inequality produces the poverty that makes people have to go to these kinds of places where, on private initiative, they get food. But to play that as a card for voters who have a anti-immigration resentment is, of course, highly dangerous, and what reminds me of the early 30s in Germany, when this term came up, Querfront, when people on the left were saying, well, we somehow have to compete with the right by going to our core votership, the working class, and then tell them, look, we need to, you know, adopt some of those things to make your life better. And that's what I guess, to a large extent, is also playing out in the US, this playing off against each other. Yeah. And it's a very tricky thing to deal with, because it's so easy to convolute the discussion around the connection between questions of social identity or migration and questions of economic inequality. And while we do have to connect them always, it's also tricky if these two factors are played off.
I don't think we're going to actually get too much further, because I haven't kept a good track of the time. But I think we've addressed some questions about how and if human beings who are involved in the arts are in situations of stress or being outside of their own context, able to come to understandings of each other and more of themselves. I mean, I think that we've established that music is a form of social action, but if artists, for instance, are able, through their more hermetic forms of living, because sometimes an artist is working only on their own, whether this kind of porousness really occurs. If one of you wants to say something that's really burning, otherwise I'm going to open it just quickly for a couple of questions, because, as I said, I haven't kept good track. Yeah.
Is there an audience microphone?
Is there an audience microphone?
Okay, good evening. Thank you very much. Okay, I would like to ask for a while, the We talked about music, about art, visual arts, and different kinds of art. First, music as a universal text is the instrument of dialogue between different cultures and different opinions and different world building. And if I would like to know if you are discussing in this meaning or just as observing what is happening.
That's me. Just observing what's happening. So, both. So I'm interested in music as a practice and as a process. That is obviously central to the work that musicians do and the way that musicians work and the way musicians express themselves, but also music as a practice that that non-musicians can learn from. So your point about conversation and dialogue and encounter is certainly true. I do a lot of work with rehearsals where I try to use musical rehearsals as models for new kinds of social thinking and social dialogue. But I'm also interested, and I think it's really important, as we just heard, to also track the way that, when we talk about the representation of migration, or the representation of the experience of being a refugee, this is not, of course, only limited to visual art, right? This is also the global popular music industry sounds the way it does right now because of forced migrations. Some of the biggest pop stars in the world are making music outside of the countries that they were born in very, very, very successful commercial industries, right? So the very language of global pop right now is a language that has been thoroughly transformed, not just since 2015, but has been thoroughly transformed by over a century or more of forced movement. That has changed the way we move and that we all move and listen and think. So I'm interested in all, unfortunately, I'm interested in all of that. I wish I wasn't, but I am.
So my question would be to Jörg Heiser, since he's in Berlin. So I have a question. So takes a minute. So there is a mixture at the time or after this welcome culture between the social work, cultural education, and artistic work, and so this is then now it's talking about a beyond Wilkommenskultur. So how would this mixture, or how this way of seeing works would be then again not mixed, or I don't know if again or not. I'll try to say it in another way. Yeah. No, in English. Yeah. So my question is, how is it possible before seeing an artwork or before even seeing an artwork from a person to imagine which kind of art is this person doing only by knowing his or her identity or the place where they belong to? And then also beside this imagination, how is it possible also to see or to perceive the work as an artwork and not a cultural or, I don't know, this social work?
The short answer is conversation. In the sense that you will never understand the work if you don't talk to the person who created it and to others who have different perceptions of the same work. I think good art is always a starter of conversation because there's something that puzzles you or something that irritates you or something that enthralls you or sometimes angers you, and this kind of discussion is a place to put into relation. And if I'm talking about Georg Baselitz, I'm talking about putting into relation what he says to his position, right? So I can also put in a different way, I can look at the relation between someone's position and the work And that doesn't necessarily mean that one determines or defines the other, but there is a correlation. And I need to work out what that correlation is. And if I come with, and that's unfortunately classically the case, and I should say that I'm probably not free of that either, is that you bring baggage, you bring projections of a psychological nature, something that basically is more about you than the person you're supposedly engaging with. And if you look at, for example, the history of ethnography throughout the 20th century, you see that all the time, even with the biggest and most important names, from Margaret Mead to Malinowski. They all brought their baggage to wherever place they went, and it took us decades, or it took the scientific decades, often a half a century to work out what might have gone wrong in this interaction. Okay. And yeah, but
we'll have one more question.
One last sentence I need to add to be more specific to your question. I think that one of the most important lessons is something that Raven, I think, brought up, and also you guys, is that we have to be super, super careful not to pigeonhole people. You know, generally speaking, that we have to say, yes, there is a certain sociological, social identity at work, there's certain factors like economy at work, but someone might do something you do not associate with that position. And that's usually exactly the point where it becomes interesting as art.
I don't have so much as a question as maybe a short report on a project that happened last year in Berlin.
Really short, because we're really late.
There is a choir in Berlin, the Begegnungschor, which is 50% newcomers, 50% old Berliners. And last year they took the songs they had been rehearsing for 1.5 years and turned them into a performance using biographic theater. So taking a look at a couple of their personal stories, and it was very interesting because we would have many elderly women who were actually raised in East Berlin, who had their personal refugee story escaping still the GDR, and those were connected then with the stories of the refugees from Syria, from Iraq, and from Afghanistan. And
they meet on a regular basis still?
They meet on a regular basis. Yeah. And what was very interesting, because at the moment we've been talking a lot about the artist as the individual and his or her art as the expression. And I think what's very important to take a look at is these communal projects where suddenly music can bring people together with a song, whether it's a newly composed song or whether it is something that has already been there in the tradition, when people exchange their traditions. I think this is something that should is worthwhile a very good look, because this is when actually communities start forming. And the approach of the individual genius artists that we have in the West might be always a bit tricky to pursue.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your attention. I think we tried to pack in too much into a short space of time, but I hope that you got some insights and some intriguing ideas.
To the second panel, which is a panel on academic life in the context of migration and the new culture of refugees. I'm going to begin by offending everybody surrounding me on the stage here. First of all, by introducing them with excessive brevity that does not correspond to their distinction and promise. And then I'll have another secret way of offending everybody. So the person who will speak last is Zahir Al-Chami, who is a doctoral student in veterinary medicine here in Berlin at the Freie Universität. Next to him is Carrie Bystrom, an associate dean at Bard College, Berlin. Bard College is an extraordinary liberal arts college. in New York, but with a global empire that most recently includes Berlin. Raji Jayaraman is an economist at the European School of Management and Technology, and Keith Wattenpaugh is a professor and founder of the Human Rights Program at the University of California, Davis. I want to say something very brief about the history of the U.S. University, which I think makes a point that we're trying to make today generally. And that is, if you think in very economical sound bites about the history of the American university, there are basically two kinds of institutions that up until at least the middle of the 20th century formed that history. There is the agriculture school-based university. Keith comes from one of those. These are very prominent, largely public institutions, which means that they are officially state institutions, although their budgets these days tend to be about 3 to 5% supported by the public sphere, by the state. And the second university is the seminary-based university. Those are largely the elite universities down the East Coast, let's say from Harvard to Duke, whose purposes in the early parts of the 19th century, but they were founded, many of them much earlier than that, were to educate elite groups of young men for the seminary, and then they branched out into other topics as well. The massive change in the identity and distinction of the U.S. university is based on immigration, based on the immigration generations of the mid-20th century, to a great extent from Europe and to a great extent from Germany, where a generation of leading professors, most famously Albert Einstein, transformed the American university into the system that it then became. And then a second wave of immigration, which is largely Asian in origin, that started somewhat later, about 2 or 3 generations later. So if we think of the powerhouse of the U.S. university system, we're thinking of a system that globalized based on the internationalization of the faculty, simultaneous with the internationalization and also the more generous representation of social classes after the Second World War, and really increasing then in the 1960s. This is a history that is extremely cherished by the faculty and the students of the U.S. university, and certainly one of the reasons why U.S. university communities have been so, relatively speaking, so vigorous in defending the principles of the access to education to diverse groups of faculty, and recently also to diverse groups of students, including the so-called DACA students, right, the program of the Deferred Action on Childhood Arrivals that is now at the center of the immigration debate in the United States. I said I would offend everybody on the panel a second time, and I'd like to do that by saying that I think my more senior colleagues around me are in agreement with me that the person here from whom we most want to hear is Zahar, because as a very accomplished doctoral student who began and continued most of his education in Syria, in a way we're all talking about him, and we don't want to talk about him. I'm speaking about you not only as a person, but as a certain symbolic figure, so we want to hear from you. But Zahar has requested to speak last, and I'll certainly honor that request. What everybody here is interested in speaking about, and then in hearing questions from you, has to do with this principle of reciprocity that I spoke about earlier, and that is, how does academic life in this particular circumstance of new forms of internationalization, globalization, new kinds of students, new kinds of faculty members that transform the university as academic life takes care of these new figures, these new people who come in need as refugees. How does this circumstance also transform the university in terms of the people who we educate, how we are educated by them, and also in terms of the kinds of programs we develop. Knowledge creation, which is the task of the university, is a very fluid business. The knowledge that is created in one generation is curated, meaning it is in a way preserved by successive generations, but while it is being preserved, it is also being transformed. So that in every field, from the natural sciences to the humanities and the arts, we have this double feeling, a double conviction of Langfristigkeit, as we say in German, and also obsolescence of knowledge. These things go together. Max Weber famously said 100 years ago that if you're going to be a scientist or a scholar, you have to be ready for your knowledge to die within one generation. A very melancholic observation, but also a very emancipatory one, because as the world changes, knowledge changes and has to remain flexible. So this is the issue of reciprocity that we all want to comment on briefly. I'll start with you, Carrie, just in random seating order.
I hope this is working. Thank you very much to Michael and to Pamela and everyone else who was involved in putting this program together. I'm really thrilled to be here, and also with the discussion in the last session, which I think we'll be able to build on quite a bit. I'm a stickler for following rules and instructions, so we were asked by email to think about two questions, right? One of them, both related to academic initiatives regarding integration and inclusion. One of them were how are programs and curricula addressing the needs of refugee students? And the second one was how do both the actual presence of refugee students as well as the general phenomenon of local and global displacement affect curriculum making in general? I'm going to talk about this from a very specific and limited perspective, in a sense, and that's from my position at Bard College Berlin, a liberal arts university. For those of you who don't know our campus, come and visit. It's a cozy and very modest campus in the north of Berlin, and in Pankow, Niederschönhausen. We have now almost 300 students, about 270 students. They're from over 60 countries, so it's a radically internationally diverse location. We focus on the humanities and the social sciences, so everything from philosophy to art history, art making, and literature. And we are accredited as both a German and a US university. So that means that students with the appropriate high school leaving examinations will graduate with both a US and a German degree. As part of our commitment to maintaining a radically international, open, and experimental university, since 2015, we've been fortunate, extremely fortunate, to be able to offer right now 17 full scholarships to students from crisis regions. I use the term students from crisis regions rather than refugee students for I hope for the rest of this talk, for many of the reasons that were raised by the speaker from the UDK on the last panel. Our students themselves have reported a great deal of discomfort with being labeled or pigeonholed in this way. So I think that these terminology questions are also something that we need to keep in mind as we go forward without the panel. We are on track to raise funds for another 13 scholarships for next year, which will bring up the total cohort of students from crisis regions to 30, which will be about 10% of our entire student body. So this is making a massive change and impact in the population of students at Bard College Berlin. So the first question was to remind us, how have we in the college been addressing the needs of refugee students? One could go on at great length about the different kinds of needs, whether or not financial, bureaucratic, also in terms of psychological support. But a lot, I think, has been said already in general discussions about these issues. And I want to focus right now just on two issues that I think get a little bit less attention, but that we've seen or I've seen in the past 3 years are very important. One of them is helping students, even once they've accessed university education in a BA program, gain the skills that they need to succeed and to be happy with their own performance across the time. And this is, in some ways, it's the same issue that we have with all BA students who start. In other ways, it's quite different because students, and I'll take the example of Syrian students, for instance, Syrian students come in, generally speaking, with very high educational standard. We all know how well prepared Syrian students have been historically, and the high state of education there, at least until the war, but coming from a very different academic culture. So those of you who are scholars of Paulo Freire and radical pedagogy may recall his idea of the deposit theory of education, in which you like put something into a bank and it stays there, and then sometime you take it out again, and that's what education is about, right? Putting things in the bank. There was more of an emphasis, as I've been told by my students and others, on memorization and on a hierarchical classroom model in which knowledge is imparted, and then one needs to recite back knowledge in particular ways. So from that basis, one of the biggest and most important things we can do, we think, is to improve skills in critical thinking and in critical writing, right? As well as in promoting more collaborative and creative approaches to knowledge production. So one course sequence that we've developed in response to to new groups of students from crisis regions has been a course sequence that's really focusing on critical writing and critical thinking skills in a collaborative, very interactive way. Ariana Simard, who has a master's in fine arts from UC Irvine, has been leading the charge on this and has really been doing, I think, some fantastic work. A second thing I would like to say, in addition to critical thinking and writing skills, is really has to do with creating spaces in the university to validate the skills and the knowledge that these students come in with. Because it's a mistake, I think, to think that what our role as a university is to teach people. Our role as a university is to allow them to acquire the skills they need to flourish and to be able to learn from and adapt to the knowledge that they're bringing to us. So one class sequence, again, that was just developed over the past 2 years by my dear colleague Marianne Detjen, and I see a couple of, in fact, graduates of this class sitting in the audience now, is a research creation course in migration histories in Germany. The idea was to create a history course that foregrounds Germany as a country of migration by focusing on stories of migration historically, but not just reading them, somewhere else in an archive, really drawing in students' own migration experiences into the classroom and allowing and encouraging students not to write traditional academic essays in response to these questions, but to create joint collaborative art projects out of this class. And they created an amazing exhibition that's now been shown twice, one time at the Berlin Wall Memorial as part of an international conference. So I think, again, critical thinking and writing skills, but also finding ways to help students develop those, but also finding ways as teachers to really acknowledge and value the different kinds of skill sets, or different grammars of learning that students from crisis regions will bring in. The second point was how the curriculum, or second question, was how the curriculum in general is changing in response to these students and their presence on campus. Those of you who share the fates, I won't say of what kind, of being involved as a professor, being involved in curricular decisions, know that this is a never-ending sort of struggle. It's certainly not an easy process to transform our curriculum or to think about what should go into it. But I can say that at least I've learned 3 lessons so far that I just want to put out there before ceding the microphone about how it is that the fortunate place we've been in order to have these students has led us to begin thinking about changing the curriculum. One of them has to do with, and I've already mentioned the first one, is about the very basics of terminology, right? We have learned, I hope, at least I have, as part of this community, that it's really important to interrogate the words and the concepts that we're using to talk about migration. I think this is done at the basis of many classes, and it's a really important process to go through, right? We need to figure out what terms make sense, what terms don't make sense, in very particular local contexts, what terms can be empowering and which ones are simply not empowering, and we should figure out alternatives too. So this process of questioning the basic vocabulary and concepts of migration is something that I think is has to be a starting point for any curricular movement. The second thing, and I'm really delighted to say a student just came up to me in the break to ask about this. The second thing we've realized, being again in the fortunate position to have so many students from Syria mainly, although also from Iraq and Afghanistan in our classes, you know, we have had traditionally I would say a transatlantic focus, looking at Europe and North America. And this is an impulse towards really globalizing in a way that I think is necessary, and also bringing in specific knowledge about Middle Eastern cultures, histories, and languages. Our students have been at the forefront of this. They've set up tandem free language classes in Turkish and Arabic and Spanish. They're teaching each other, right, how these languages that we haven't yet been able to incorporate into the curriculum. And I hope that we'll be able to follow their lead. We're planning on doing that to the extent possible in the near future. The third thing that I'd say is that to think comprehensively about curriculum, it's really important that we have the following approach. I've been working on this as part of a consortium of liberal arts colleges, Bard College Berlin, Vassar College, Sarah Lawrence College, Bennington College, and Bard in the US. We've been together designing a set of principles for a much wider forced migration curriculum. The first one is that it has to be migrant centered. So again, you know, reflecting the opposite sort of order of this panel in this sense, but to begin from the point of learning from people who have experienced forced displacement. The second one is that it has to be geographically and historically comprehensive. Right now, most of the studies of migration will fall into, say, American studies or even hemispheric studies in the United States, or they fall into European studies or Middle Eastern studies. But migration is a global issue. People are moving because of local concerns, but also that are connected in a global landscape and that have a deep historical background. We can't have a migration curriculum that doesn't look globally and also deep historically to figure out what's going on. And the third thing is we really believe that it has to be about connecting academic theory or academic research and practice. So finding ways that we can move students and research production beyond the classroom and into the public sphere. So those are some thoughts that we've gathered in various research projects and having the fortune to work with these students over the past 2 years. Thank you.
A great series of principles and illustrations. I think you'll agree that it combines these 2 points of access to education and transformation of education, again, coming from the institutional side and from the student side. Keith Wattenpaugh, University of California, you're a scholar of the Middle East and an advocate of refugee higher education student populations from the Middle East, especially Syria. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about some of the highlights of your work.
Well, I was hoping to address also just the possible role of the humanities and social sciences in moving newcomer populations into what I call pathways of social inclusion. And so that my answer will have 2 parts. The first part is, what can higher education, what can the humanities and arts and social sciences as fields do as part of this process of producing ways to better include newcomers in our societies. And one area I would just emphasize is one of the things that the arts and humanities can do is they can explain how often the assumption about about newcomers and refugees and others is that these are people without art, without culture, and without history. At least art, culture, and history that's invisible to the host society, the societies that are coming into. But what the arts and humanities can do is make that history and that culture and that artistic experience much more visible. And that's one of the, I think, one of the chief burdens of academia in this historical moment. I mean, we're in a room. I was very pleased to know that we're in a room named for Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and I don't see this as a moment of crisis, because there are just as many refugees as a portion of the global population now as there were 30 years ago. But where there is a problem is the political will, right? And so this is a time that doesn't need to be thought of in terms of crisis. It's a time that needs to be thought of in terms of courage. Courage to look differently at the role of the humanities and social sciences in society, to move ourselves back into the public sphere from which we've been sort of pushed out of by the over-fascination with STEM fields, with the denigration of the humanities and arts and the denigration of humanities and arts professionals in both the United States and I think in Europe as well. That if we want to prove our relevance, this is the historical moment for historians and literature people and artists to do so, because we can be part of building the pathways of inclusion for newcomers. And the same tools and techniques to help the newcomers be included are also the same kind of tools we should have already been using to help those that are underrepresented in our societies, who are oppressed and on the margins already. So that's one half of the answer. But the second half of my answer is that we need to now commit to making a multi-generational investment in newcomers in the fields of the arts, humanities, and social sciences. Because it's not, in the long term, it's not people like me who should be speaking. It's the newcomers themselves who should be given an opportunity to speak and represent themselves. But that's not magic. That's an investment over time in terms of recruiting and validating the humanities and social science experience, in cultivating, getting people into grad school, getting them postdocs, and helping them identify positions and moving into the professional sphere. So this is one field that I would ask us to think about, which is how we can bring, is it still on? Okay. How we can bring what we do as humanists and in the humanities to the forefront of a social process. I think I'll end there, because that's a good place to end.
You'll have a second chance, sure, if you want to. Let me turn to Rajshri Jayaraman, whose formal field in economics is developmental economics, but I've heard you describe your work as migration economics, and on this question of how fields are reinventing themselves. Is that an exaggeration, or is that what is happening?
Okay, so this is a question I was not prepared to answer, but I'm happy to attempt to answer it. So economics, I think, rightly or wrongly, in business education more broadly, I feel like I don't want to say among enemies in this audience, but I suspect that I'm not the most popular person in the room, given my profession, and as no, that's I experience moments of self-hatred as well. So, rightly or wrongly, economics has this reputation of being a little cold-hearted and efficient, and I guess neoliberal is a bad word these days. Probably for good reason. So I'm sort of listening to this conversation with some degree of envy, when I hear that Bard is completely reinventing a curriculum in order to, take into account other focuses, and, the humanity and the arts should be thinking of new ways of engaging with, migrants in this new social process. These are concepts that are completely alien to a field such as mine, which is very much focused on a given set of methods. And I don't even think of it as ideologies. I just think of it as agnostic methods. I understand they have consequences, but they're just a series of methods. And what that means in terms of, say, curricular development or adaptation or engagement, there's very little that's done in economics, for instance, in terms of curriculum adaptation to accommodate for this this new field. That being said, economists have studied migration issues for a very, very long time. And the questions that we ask may be unglamorous, but they're not irrelevant in the sense that, two of the major questions that economists have spent a lot of time thinking about is, and when I use the word integration, I don't mean assimilation, I don't mean any sort of, value-oriented concepts with that. I just mean integration in the labor market, meaning you get a job. I mean that completely agnostically. Get a job and are able to earn a living, and as banal as that sounds, I mean, I would argue that, maybe I don't have that much time to spend on art projects if I can't put food on the table. So I don't think this is a trivial consideration in the grand scheme of things. So we spent a lot of time thinking about those things. And so we ask questions like, what is it that equips, what is it that makes a refugee, I apologize for using that word, but I will continue to use it out of habit, not value judgments. What is it that makes a refugee more or less likely to integrate in the labor market? That's an important question, even if it's not as glamorous as making art. What is the impact of refugees on I'll call it the native or the German population? That is a really important political economy question, because that's what, that's the basis upon which the ship sinks or swims. In terms of the entire refugee project. So these questions are not glamorous, but they're important questions. And in that context, maybe, I'm not sure whether I've overspoken my welcome, but maybe I can just make a few points regarding the state of affairs here in Germany. This is an area that I'm currently doing research in. Again, I listen with great envy when I think about, curricular redesign, because that assumes that you actually have enough people in your student body to make it worthwhile to think about such a curricular redesign. If I have a student body of, you said, 300 students, and one of them is a new Syrian refugee, I'm not going to redesign my curriculum based on that one student. That's just not, and otherwise there are 300 curricular redesigns that one would have to do. I think you can start thinking about these types of things in some ways once you've, going back to the original question in terms of allowing students to participate in education or higher education, there are certain really basic hurdles that need to be overcome in order to get to that place. And there are four in particular that are worth emphasizing. I mean, one is language. Okay, this is a real biggie, and I think, Zahir will speak a little bit about this, I think, I hope, when your turn comes. This is a huge hurdle. I've been in this country for 15 years now. I speak German. I hope to, in a not respectable perhaps, but a possible manner. It is not a trivial language to learn, and I say this as a native, Tamil speaker. My language is not easy, and German is not easy. Interestingly enough, similar grammatical structure, but that's just a little tidbit you may need. Okay, so language is a huge hurdle in terms of getting an education. And then in terms of, participating in language courses, there's timing. You need to go through all these hurdles in terms of navigating the German bureaucracy. Not an easy task. And then you're required at specific hours to attend integration courses in which, these are really basic things before we even start talking about curricular redesign. Not all refugees are entitled to participate in free language courses. Unless you come from these, 5 nations from which you're granted asylum status. If you're an Afghani refugee, you're not entitled to participate in an integration course, which means that you need to oftentimes pay out of pocket to get a language course, which is a necessary condition for university participation. And then the big one here is childcare for women. Okay, so 1/4 of all recent refugees are women. 3/4 are men. That's interesting as well. Okay, so 1/4 of them are women. If you have a young kid at home, what do? You don't have childcare. let me stop there. There are a few other, I said there were 4 points. I've talked about one of them. I can talk about the other 3 a little later, but we should let Zahir have a chance to.
Thank you very much for your invitation. And I would like to talk about, I want to continue talking about the obstacles which we will face in the future. Or at the beginning, I should talk briefly about why I decided to come to Germany. After I had finished my master, I want to continue my studies, but I have to wait about 6 months. At this time, I had to go to military service, so I decided to go to Germany. Why I decided to go to Germany? Because the German universities have very good reputation, and also most of my professors had studied here in Germany. In the first month I arrived in Germany, I have sent many emails to doctors here professors in Germany, and it was difficult for me to get doctoral place easy. So one time I found on Facebook there is a group for Syrian vets. So my supervisor posted a request that they need doctoral students here in Berlin. So I talked to him, and after that he talked to my professor, and then my professor accepted me. But I have the first obstacle is I have been studying here in Berlin since 2.5 years, but without any scholarship. And I don't know any organization can support me. Only DFG. But but the problem is our institute doesn't have any contracts with the DFG organization. This is my first obstacle. The second one, my bachelor degree is not recognized here in Germany to work as a vet. So I have to do 15 different tests in different subjects at the university, and they are all in German. And this is also obstacle for me. It is easier for me to study in English, and also I have suggestion. I have only one chance to do these tests, and if I fail, it is not allowed to me to do the test again. So this is the second obstacle. So I don't know, maybe why my suggestion is that how it could be if there is a preparatory course before we do these tests, or online courses which will help us or guide us to to pass these tests easily.
Zaya, are there forums hosted either by the university or by government ministries where these kinds of suggestions are at least listened to? People with experience like yours who understand perhaps how to make the system more productive?
Sorry, I didn't...
Is there a place in the German world, either in the university or the government, where you can go and make these suggestions to people responsible for policy making?
To be honest, I don't know.
I don't know
where. I don't know where can I ask, or but there is always many clubs or Vereins. They are trying to help us to, or they are suggesting like these courses, for example, or they are suggesting some help for getting a scholarship.
I wanted to ask another question to Keith, partly since among us he's the visitor and we'll go back to California at the end of the week, but it has to do with this kind of issue, and then maybe we'll open it up to questions from the audience, and that is to, in this context, to say something about your project, Article 26 Backpack.
So, thank you. We've been, last 5 years, I've been working with young people displaced from the war in Syria who have been, should have been in college or were in college at the time of the conflict, and trying to find ways to reduce the barriers to admission and to sort of success in higher education and employment. And while many of the problems that Zahir has, one problem he didn't talk about was missing documentation or having documents. Actually, you do. There's your certificate is not necessarily recognized by the German state.
Yes. Sorry, but
right.
only for working as a vet.
Only for working, right.
Only for working.
So one of our goals is actually to figure out better ways to have credentials like that evaluated in the possibility that they could be accepted outside. But that's, of course, a big if. It would, we would have to investigate that further. But so we developed an online cloud-based tool where refugee students and others who need it can safely store and share their academic documentation, can also request high-level credential evaluation, and even the possibility of credential reconstruction. Because often you're fleeing in the middle of the night, you don't have time to stop by and pick up your transcript on the way out of town, and then anytime you seek to get an official transcript, I know it must be difficult for you to get your transcripts from Jamat Bas. Is that correct? Do you think you could get yours?
No. I had with me all my certificates.
Right. As pieces of paper, correct?
Yes.
And you know where they all are right now?
Yes.
Okay, good.
Yes.
I won't, but that's unusual, in fact. But the idea is that the backpack would provide you an opportunity to, in fact, store digital copies, so that anxiety of possibly losing them wouldn't be there in the future. But there's something more. There's something from my experience, much more, to some extent, more telling about his experience, Zahir's experience, which is that one sort of global ask that many of us in higher education in emergencies are asking of higher education systems around the world is to really examine their entry requirements and to identify those things that may in fact be unnecessary or arbitrary barriers for refugee or other at-risk migrant students. The point being that that the rigidity of admissions, especially in Germany and other parts, even in the United States, is such that the inflexibility cannot allow for special circumstance very well. And so one of the things we're asking is for national systems or state systems or various other kinds of admissions processes to systematically think about whether or not the way they make decisions about young people applying can be made more flexible and more open and more understanding, or alternatives to certain kinds of tests could be used, or alternatives to certain kinds of documentation could be employed. Because the ultimate goal is to get people in, and time will tell if they should be there. And I mean, you're obviously a wonderful student and doing well at Free University. So these are many of the issues, and what we've done with time is just try to understand some of these barriers and push them aside. But other ones will be, money should not be a barrier in a modern society like Germany for people going to school, nor should it be in the United States, but it is, right? So, thank you.
I think we have a few minutes for some questions and conversation from the audience. The mic is going around. Fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I want to ask, what can academia do to achieve a 50-50% rate of admissions instead of the 75 male admission that seemed to be going on?
If I may, there's a phenomenon that is true not just in Germany, but in all those areas where there's been displacement of young people, primarily from Syria, but also from Iraq, as well as Iran, which is that in those original countries or countries of origin, male and female attendance in higher education was almost equal, 50-50. And then in exile, the number of women continuing to participate in higher education plummets. And a figure that Robert Templer was able to say yesterday was something around down to about 5% of the original number. So it's as though you have a situation where half of all men and half of all women are going to school, and then women disappear almost entirely from the student body from refugee and at-risk students. I don't think we understand why that's happening well enough now, but it really, I think, requires a sophisticated and consistent form of outreach that involves primarily representatives from the refugee and at-risk migrant communities taking the lead, and also doing very good old-fashioned economic and social scientific research to try to understand what the specific barriers are for women's participation in higher education.
So maybe I can speak to that a little bit in the German context. When Keith said that it's 50-50 in terms of university education in many of these countries like Iran, Iraq. I don't know about Syria, but Iran, Iraq, Syria as well. The first thing to sort of recognize is that we're not getting a random sample of university students in Germany. Okay, so the people that are coming to Germany, first of all, they're 75% male. So right there, never mind whether they're university educated or not, right there, you don't have the 50-50. So it's not just a question of once they're here, let's make sure women participate in equal measure. They're not here in equal measure. So honestly, like even assuming that the proportion of people with higher education, university education, were equally distributed among males and females, which is not. Women that come to Germany as refugees are much worse educated than men that come to Germany on average. Even assuming that, you're not going to get to 50-50 just because of the distribution of the arriving population in Germany. So it's not that, once they're here, if we try hard enough, we'll get 50-50. They're not here in those proportions to begin with.
Thank you. My name is Yahya Al-Aus. I am a Syrian journalist. Actually, I want to ensure about what the lady said, that the job market, which is very important. I think 2 months in job is better than 1 year in languages courses, which is because you can find a lot of friends and you can really integrate it in what the government want. If you want to have a look about the cultural events among the refugees in Berlin, as example, you will find thousands of activities happened. From time to every single day, there are many events, which is not just cooking or gardening. It's as well readings and theater and movies and a lot and dancing. So what I think is these kind of events who should be integrated. You can't leave it alone. If you want to go to these events, you will find a little bit German in these events. I don't know if this could affect this. If we go like this, after 1 year, you will find these events like a parallel life. It will be isolated, and it will be more closed and more isolated. This is very bad and more local as well. I think a lot of minority here, for example, the Syrians will be very happy if they share their foods with the German, but they will be more happy if they share their music and theater and movies and their culture and their values, which is not going in the right way till now. Just that, thank you.
Maybe one more question. Go ahead.
I think this is a really important insight and question. I can only say that in terms to get back to some of the propositions or the discussion about integration that was made earlier. Keith has been using the term social inclusion. I mean, I just think that school, especially at the primary level, but the further up you go, it remains crucially important. Like, these are really the institutions in which it is possible to create meaningful, non-hierarchical relationships between people who are from very different backgrounds, and that it's in the basis, it's the meaning of education itself, right? To learn from the people and with the people who are around you, and to create solidarities that matter. And if I don't want to be naive about this. Obviously, schools are heavily striated, class, race, and other ways, but I do think it provides one of the best examples of an institution where exactly that kind of mutual relationship can come into existence, and that's what we absolutely need to aim for, because what you point out as a picture of two parallel societies, that's terrifying. That's exactly what we don't want to end up. After having been fortunate enough to be here in 2015, when my government in the U.S. was creating the so-called Muslim ban and ordering wall prototypes, it was so inspiring to be here. And a government that said, okay, at least temporarily, okay, come in. And to waste that chance to make something, I think would be a huge mistake and quite a loss for Berlin, and for Germany and Europe more widely.
Can I just add to that with just a footnote? First of all, in terms of, again, going back to sort of dry statistics, the good news is that if kids, there are lots of young people, so 70% of the new migrants are below the age of 30. Okay, so this is a very young population in general. If they are then on top of that of school-going age, that is the best hope in terms of social integration, right? Because Germany, I guess, has learned from the Gastarbeiter program not to have these segregated schools. Children are mainstreamed into German schools, and that's really good news because they learn the language quickly, they have German friends, and that's great in terms of social integration. What is, I think, one of the big hurdles in terms of getting the kinds of integration that you're speaking about, cultural events where then, new migrants have the opportunity to make bonds, like form bonds with the local population, is in the adult population. And the big hurdle there is housing. So if there were lots of vacant houses that were sort of randomly scattered among Germans, then the hopes for integration, social integration, are much larger, but that's not what's happening. Because the networks then tend to be built geographically in buildings that happen to be empty. What happens then is, you know, you may have cultural events, but it's going to be ghettoized cultural events. And it's this this unglamorous logistical situation that really doesn't serve the purpose of the kind of hope that this kind of process promises.
I think we should conclude, and in talking about these really crucial spaces, I would like to thank the Staatsbibliothek once again for really providing not only the space but the spirit for this kind of exchange. I hope it'll be the first of many, and I also want to thank both groups of panelists for this very conscientious and very inspiring conversation. So thanks to all of you, thanks to you for coming and being here, and let's continue the conversation. Thank you.